Okay, hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to go through the books that I read in March, and then I'll go through some of my reading plans for April. March was a much more productive reading month than I was expecting, but even considering that, I'm still going to keep my plans for April as bare as I can, really, because I'm expecting it to be quite a busy month. There are three books I think I've already mentioned for March in an update video, so I'll just quickly go through those. There was Sonnets to Orpheus by Rilke. This is a translation by Christian Marx. I'd read it before in other translations, so I just wanted to see what this one was like. And on the whole, I liked it. Every now and then there were sort of choices made that I didn't particularly like, but on the whole, I enjoyed it. I felt the poems came through, and I felt in this reread I got a better idea of what Rilke is doing in these poems. So I, on the whole, really enjoyed the experience of that. This one was a great surprise. I read the first four books of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and just really loved them. I loved the world. I loved sort of just the way that she tells stories, and really just her writing style as well. So it was, yeah, just a joy to come across these books and to um yeah, just to spend time in them. It was just a lot of fun. So I'll be picking up some more Le Guin soon, I think. Then we've got A Confession and Other Religious Writings by Leo Tolstoy. I read this with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. I think both of us more or less had the same opinion. It was quite dry. Every now and then he says something interesting, makes some fairly acute observations about um, religious and cultural life at the time. But yeah, on the whole, a bit dry, and he's very idiosyncratic. And I should say this is the sort of Jane Kentish translation of those essays. And then most of my time in March was spent reading Don Quixote by Cervantes, and this was my first time reading this, and I really enjoyed it. I have heard people say that it can feel a bit repetitive, and that the style of the humour is maybe a little over the top. But for me, I really actually quite enjoyed it. I did find it quite funny and entertaining. It sort of reminded me of a lot of the cartoons and sort of comedy shows that I quite like. That rather eccentric slapstick humour. It's the kind of stuff I like, really. And it's a book of two halves. And so there's a Don Quixote part one and then a part two. And I was just planning to read part one in March, for March of the Mammoths, and then whenever I had time later on in the year, I'd pick up part two. But I was enjoying part one so much, I actually went straight on to part two. I just read the whole thing and really enjoyed it. Part one is, I suppose, when people think of Don Quixote, most of what you think of is in Don Quixote Part 1. So we're meeting our main character, a rather deluded landowner who, I suppose, through his constant reading of these chivalric romances, has kind of convinced himself that he is a knight, and that he has to go out and go on these adventures and right wrongs and save people from perilous situations. Um, and most of the time, whenever he tries to help people, he he just makes it worse. So there's an encounter early on where he comes across a young farm labourer being beaten up by his boss, and he threatens the boss and thinks that he saved the farm labourer, whereas actually he's just made the boss more angry, and so the boy actually just gets beaten up even more. And then as it goes on, Don Quixote and his sidekick, his squire Sancho Panza, they also get beaten up quite a lot. Most of the stories involves at least one of them getting beaten up or getting into some kind of scrape. And then there's part two, which I suppose it's sort of concerned with quite a lot of the sort of tensions that have been going on, and the main tension really has been that there are some people in his household and some people in his community who are quite distressed at the fact that Don Quixote is living in a fantasy, um, and so they're trying to bring him back into the real world. And part one actually ends with one of their schemes to get him back, and they do actually succeed. And actually, in their attempts to do this, they meet all these people, and there are these people in these really absurd, dramatic situations. Lots of spurned lovers and people who've escaped their countries and have been in prison and things. And it's sort of like a Shakespearean comedy, and then somehow they all end up together and it all works out, and they're all kind of there because they've met Don Quixote, or at least most of them are. And so it's maybe the one instance in the whole thing where totally unbeknownst to Don Quixote, he's actually kind of actually helped people, I suppose, but he hasn't actually tried to, and it's all through happenstance. But it's maybe the one instance where there is some resolution, because Don Quixote is out there and people are trying to get him back home. And then that carries on into part two as well. That there are people who are just trying to get him back home, but it is a little bit different. Probably the main difference in part two is that there have been some time between the two parts. There's a gap of 10 years, and in that gap, in real life, there have been people writing sort of pirate versions of Don Quixote Part 2, and then Cervantes heard about it and so had to write the authoritative version. But then in the book, people have also been writing about Don Quixote, and there are a few instances where people are confused as to whether he really is the real Don Quixote, because in the stories they've heard he's done all these things, but he hasn't actually done those things or hasn't done them yet, and he's trying to work out whether, or sometimes he's thinking about doing something, but then decides not to do it because that's been in the stories, and he wants to be the real Don Quixote and not the Don Quixote from the stories. And then the other difference is that in the first part, it's really all about Don Quixote's delusions. So he sees something, he's convinced that it's something else, like the windmills are actually giants, and that he's trying to convince Sancho, and Sancho doesn't believe him but kind of goes along with it anyway. Whereas in the second part, there are people deliberately setting up situations for Don Quixote, either for their own amusement and entertainment. So there's a Duke and Duchess who, for quite a long time in the second part, just keep on setting up these situations for Don Quixote because they find him so amusing. And so, they're convincing Don Quixote rather than him sort of convincing himself. But then also there are schemes to get him back, and in these schemes as well, people are dressing up and pretending to be knights and squires and things like that. And so suddenly people are engaging in this fantasy world of Don Quixote, kind of making it feel all the more real for him. And yet actually it's sort of even more of a fantasy, I suppose. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting book, and it gets quite sad towards the end. But I really, really loved it, and I really loved how really compassionate Cervantes is in the way he deals with Don Quixote, because he could just be a total laughing stock, whereas actually he deals with him really quite carefully and with a lot of love. I think that there are parts where, like there's a part when they're in an inn, and Don Quixote is convinced that it's a castle, and so when the narrator is following Don Quixote around, he's sort of calling everything, um, the name that Don Quixote would give it. So it is a castle. The innkeeper is the lord, and there's a princess, and there's a moat, and sort of all of that. And then as soon as he's dealing with other characters, it's back to what it actually is, but the narrator is kind of willing to humour Don Quixote, and I found that really quite lovely. So yeah, a book I'll certainly be revisiting. This was the J.M. Cohen translation. It's a relatively old one, I think from the 1950s. So I'd be intrigued to try a slightly more modern translation and see how it compares. And then going on from there, I read or I listened to an ebook, an audio book, as a bit of an experiment. So I've just had a baby, so I'm trying to see whether that's something that I'd find useful, whether it's a way I can engage with books when I have less time for reading books physically or on an e-reader. But I didn't really choose the best thing. I read a very short introduction to Hegel in those, the little very short introduction books that I think Oxford University put out. And it was interesting, and it gave me a sort of a rough idea of what his preoccupations were, and what he was really talking about, I suppose, in his philosophy. And so it was useful so that when he's brought up, I have a better idea of, I suppose, what he represents and what he, sort of what he sort of added to the table, I suppose. But I didn't retain all that much because I was just listening to it, and I think I retain a bit more when I'm reading the book and I have the text in front of me. Then going on from there, I read City by Clifford D. Simak. So this was there's a read along that Sean D. Standfast was doing of City. So we're reading a couple of stories from here throughout the sort of per week throughout the month of March, and I really really enjoyed it. It's a fix-up novel of multiple short stories. But as you're reading them and as you're going through, you realise that they're telling this really, really long story about the progress and eventual sort of disappearance of humanity, and then the progress of other species. So there's talking dogs, there are mutant humans, and there are robots. And I found it really, really interesting. It doesn't go in the direction that you would expect. And I think there is a lot in there to unpack, because he doesn't always explain everything. So he gives quite a lot of space for interpretation. But I think one of the things I took away from this was, once a society has advanced to a point where they don't really need to struggle to survive anymore. So once they're sort of catered to hand and foot, is there actually any reason to keep on going? And I think there are a few instances where there are a couple of civilizations, I think, that are having to ask themselves that question. So just some interesting questions about the advancement of society and what directions it could go in. That was a lot of fun, and I'll probably be joining in with some more Simak reading events later on in the year. And then the last thing that I finished this month was On the Shortness of Life by Seneca, which I think is two letters of consolation to friends and family members, and then there's a sort of dialogue at the end as well. And on the whole, it was pretty interesting. The advice he's giving is sort of commonsensical, really, about so like he says, have money, but don't have too much money, and don't have too little money either. So I suppose it's all right for some. And if you're finding your life is meaningless, maybe consider going out into public life and maybe into politics. But if you're finding that that's too much for you, start sort of moving away from it when you feel you need to, and not when other people notice that you're doing a bad job. And so again, it's all right for some to take an early retirement, I suppose. And so it's very much, I think, to the people that he's writing to. But there's still plenty, that you can apply to your own life if you want to. There are times when he comes across a little, I suppose, a little snobbish at times. But yeah, again, it was interesting, and I might try and revisit some Seneca at some point. And then there are a few things that I'm kind of in the middle of at the moment. So I've been reading Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt. It's a big 1,000-page sort of history of poetry in English, and I've been really, really loving it. It's just been getting me really, really excited. Um, Initially, it was sort of in the Middle Ages when he was talking about Gower and Langland and Chaucer. I have a rough sort of familiarity with Chaucer, but not so much with Langland or Gower. And so it's just really lovely and really, yeah, just really great to get a better idea of what their lives were like, and then what their body of work is like, and kind of what to expect if you want to try and read them. And then the same goes for sort of later poetry of, I suppose, the English Renaissance of sort of Elizabethan poetry and Jacobean poetry, the Cavalier poets and things like that. I'm just up to John Milton at the moment. And again, that period with John Donne and Henry Vaughan, and is it Robert Herrick? I'm getting sometimes get all the names muddled up. Yeah, Robert Herrick, George Herbert, people like that. I just find really exciting. There's a kind of a lusciousness to their language that I really love, and so I'm wondering whether I'm going to find it as exciting when I move into um, areas of poetry that I haven't explored that much, or I just don't appreciate that much. So particularly the Restoration period of poetry after the English Civil War. A lot of that I don't particularly like. I find it a little too neat and a little too proper. So I'm wondering whether this will change my mind, or whether I'll sort of still have the same opinions about people like Dryden and Pope once I've finished. But yeah, there's still plenty to get through. I'm not even a quarter of the way through yet. And then I've been going through Sylvia Plath's collected poetry, which has been really, really great. I've been kind of remembering that she was one of the first poets that I really got into, and I think a lot of the poems in here are my sort of ideal version of what a successful, well-written poem is. And so it's just been really satisfying to revisit them and find some poems that I'm less familiar with, that maybe didn't make it into any of her collections. And also all the poems are arranged by year, chronologically, and sort of by date as well, because it seems like she was pretty good at sort of keeping up to date with when she'd written her poems. And so you're getting her sort of progression as a poet as well. So that's been just really great to see as well, and seeing her style develop. And then also over the last few days, I've been reading quite a lot from Kafka's Diaries. So I've been sort of dipping in and out of them this year, and I'm coming up to about halfway through now. And I don't really know why. I've just been finding them a lot more, just much more interesting, really. Sort of in the last 100 pages or so, there's been the first drafts to his story, The Judgment, and it's almost, I think, as it would appear later on when it's eventually published. And also there's the sort of initial drafts to the opening of America as well, so one of his novels. So it was just interesting to see both of those works kind of in their gestation period, I suppose. And then I think that's everything I'm reading at the moment. So just a couple of things that I've sort of put aside for April. The main thing that I want to read is Les Misérables, and there are sort of two read-alongs going on. So the main one is Classics and Company, and they're reading Les Misérables from or through April up until sort of mid-May. So they've got a Discord server, so I'll be sort of going in there and sort of hopefully do my best to chat away. I'm not always very good on Discord, but also due to my own sort of disorganization, I also suggested April as a time to read this as a group read with some other people as well. So kind of got the best of both worlds, I suppose. I've got sort of two groups of people to talk about this book because we'll be reading the book at the same time. And I'm just really intrigued to see what I think of it. And I'm really enjoying reading these sort of big mammoths as well. So I'm just excited to immerse myself in that as well. And then I was just looking through my shelves at a sort of a potential book to have just in case I finish Les Misérables in April. And I picked up The Exiles Return by Elizabeth de Waal, which is a book about a family returning to Vienna, I think after the First World War, but it might be after the Second World War. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, it's about a Jewish family returning to Vienna, so it might be after the Second World War. But in this lovely Persephone edition, which I really loved their end papers, and there's a matching bookmark as well. And I've had this waiting on my shelves for a very long time, and so I'll hopefully get to this in April if I finish Les Misérables before the end of the month. And then the other thing that I'd like to read if I finish Sylvia Plath's collected poems, because I like to have a book of poetry and sort of fiction and non-fiction sort of all going on at the same time. So if I can get the cover up, let's see if it's behaving. Yeah, I quite like to read The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser, which is a long sort of epic allegory, very much in the kind of chivalric tradition, I suppose. It might have been something that Don Quixote would have enjoyed reading if he'd lived a bit longer and learned English, I suppose. But I was inspired to read this from reading Lives of the Poets, and I just wanted to jump into some of that poetry of the period that I was reading about. So I'm going to try and read this in April if there's a window for it. Spenser's spelling is really rather odd. If you can make it out there, it's quite archaic. It's a kind of pseudo medieval spelling, but there's some introductory sonnets earlier on that I was reading. So like this one here, and I was reading them out loud, and I was finding that my mouth was catching the words and recognizing the words before my eye noticed that they were spelt differently. So it might be that I'll just have to read the whole thing out loud to myself or to my daughter if yeah, I'm sure it'd be something that would put her to sleep. So there we go. That's everything that I've got planned for April and everything that I finished in March. I hope you had a lovely reading month in March, and hopefully yeah, April will turn out pretty well for you. But yeah, for now, thank you very much for watching, and I hopefully will see you very soon. Bye bye.